In 1985, the most handsome man in America was finally seen, only when his beauty was destroyed. October 2nd, 1985, UCLA Medical Center, Los Angeles. Rock Hudson lay dying, and the world finally knew his secret. Not just the AIDS that had been announced 3 months earlier, sending shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. But the other secret, the one he'd carried for 35 years of stardom, the one that had made him the loneliest leading man in Hollywood. Rock Hudson, the man every woman wanted, had never wanted women at all. The man in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the matinee idol who dominated screens in the 1950s and 60s. AIDS had ravaged that 6'4" frame, turned those broad shoulders skeletal, hollowed out the face that had launched 1,000 dreams. He weighed 98 pounds. His skin was covered in lesions. The most handsome man in America had become a ghost of himself, and in that ghostliness, finally, terrifyingly, he was real. The media circus outside was relentless. Reporters wanted statements, updates, photos, anything to feed a story that had everything Hollywood loves. Beauty destroyed, secrets revealed. A fall from grace so spectacular it felt biblical. Rock Hudson, the ultimate leading man, dying of the gay plague that America had been content to ignore until it touched someone they loved, until it touched their fantasy. Inside the room, Elizabeth Taylor held his hand. She'd known the truth for decades. His secrets weren't secrets to his real friends. She'd watched him play the perfect gentleman at premieres while his heart belonged to men he could never acknowledge. She'd attended his sham marriage to Phyllis Gates in 1955, a desperate attempt to silence rumors that threatened his career. She'd seen him build a fortress of lies around himself, brick by brick, smile by smile, until the fortress became a prison. "Hollywood made me the man every woman wanted," Rock had told her once, in a rare moment of honesty. "It never let me be the man I was." And now, dying at 59, wasted by a disease the government wouldn't fund research for because it was killing the wrong people, Rock Hudson was finally, irrevocably himself. Too late. Far too late. But here's what haunted everyone in that room. Rock had known he was sick for over a year before going public. He'd kept working, kept pretending, kept playing the role Hollywood had written for him. Even dying, he'd tried to maintain the illusion. Only when he could no longer stand, when the lesions couldn't be hidden by makeup, when the secret threatened to become a scandal, did he finally tell the truth. And even then it wasn't his choice. He was outed by circumstance, by disease, by the simple fact that his body could no longer perform the lie. The official cause of death would be AIDS-related complications. But the truth was more complex. Rock Hudson was killed by AIDS, yes, but he was also killed by decades of living in fear, of loving in secret, of being someone else every moment of his public life. He was killed by a Hollywood system that made him a star on the condition that he never, ever be real. He was killed by an America that adored him as long as he stayed safely heterosexual, safely masculine, safely fake. His friends knew the real Rock, Roy, as some called him, using his birth name like a secret password. They knew he was funny, loyal, generous. They knew about the parties at his house, the only place he could be himself. They knew about Mark Christian, his partner, who would later sue his estate, claiming Rock had knowingly exposed him to AIDS. They knew about the long line of men Rock had loved in the shadows, never in the light. But America didn't know Roy. America knew Rock Hudson, the invented man, the product, the fantasy. 6'4" of handsome masculinity, the safe choice, the reliable romantic lead who made women swoon and men want to be him. That Rock Hudson was invincible, uncomplicated, eternally available yet eternally out of reach. That Rock Hudson couldn't be gay because his entire career was built on the opposite premise. Did Rock understand, in those final days, that his death would change everything? that by becoming the first major celebrity to die of AIDS, he would force America to acknowledge the epidemic it had been content to ignore? That his tragedy would become the catalyst for funding, research, awareness, all the things that came too late for him but might save countless others? AIDS is not just my disease, he'd said in one of his final statements. It is our wake-up call. But what a price to pay for that awakening. Your entire life lived as a lie, and only in death does the truth matter enough to change the world. The man dying in that hospital bed had played heroes on screen. Off-screen, he'd lived in fear of exposure, of scandal, of losing everything he'd built on a foundation of deception. And now, at the end, the fear was over. Not because he'd overcome it, but because there was nothing left to lose. The secret was out. The career was over. The man every woman wanted was revealed as the man who'd never wanted them back. To understand how Rock Hudson became both an icon and a prisoner, we must go back to the beginning, to Winnetka, Illinois, and a boy named Roy Harold Scherer, Jr., who had no idea that Hollywood would take everything he was and replace it with something spectacular, profitable, and utterly hollow. Winnetka, Illinois, 1925. Roy Harold Scherer, Jr. was born on November 17th into a working-class family that would fracture before he understood what family meant. His father, also Roy, abandoned them when the boy was young. His mother, Catherine, remarried Wallace Fitzgerald, who adopted Roy and gave him a new name, Roy Fitzgerald. Already, even as a child, Roy was learning that identity was negotiable, that who you were could be erased and rewritten by someone else's decision. The Depression years were hard. Roy grew up poor, watching his mother work multiple jobs, understanding early that security was an illusion, and survival required adaptability. He was a big kid, tall for his age, broad-shouldered even as a teenager, handsome, though he didn't know it yet. Or if he did, he didn't understand what that handsomeness would cost him. High school brought the first hints of difference. While other boys pursued girls with expected teenage fervor, Roy felt something else, something he couldn't name, couldn't acknowledge, couldn't even think about without shame. This was the 1940s in Middle America. Being different wasn't just unacceptable, it was dangerous. So Roy learned to perform, to play the role of normal, to hide whatever he felt behind a smile and a shrug. After high school, he joined the Navy. World War II was ending, but they still needed men. He served as an aircraft mechanic, competent but unremarkable. The military, with its rigid masculinity, its codes and hierarchies, taught Roy another valuable lesson. If you played the part convincingly enough, nobody looked deeper. As long as you acted like everyone else, you could be invisible in plain sight. Discharged in 1946, Roy returned to a civilian life with no direction. He worked as a vacuum cleaner salesman, failed at it. Worked as a truck driver, found it soul-crushing. Ended up as a telephone repairman, climbing poles and fixing lines, a job that kept him alive but nowhere near living. At night, he'd go to movies, watching men like Cary Grant and Clark Gable, wondering what it would be like to be someone other than Roy Fitzgerald, small-town nobody going nowhere. Then came the accident that changed everything. Or perhaps it was fate, or perhaps just Hollywood's insatiable hunger for new meat. Roy was driving his truck when he met someone who knew Henry Wilson, one of Hollywood's most successful talent agents. Wilson had an eye for young men, beautiful, malleable young men he could shape into stars. He took one look at Roy Fitzgerald and saw potential. Not talent, not yet, just raw material. 6'4", square jaw, broad shoulders, that indefinable quality the camera loves. Could these early experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs and tragedies? Did growing up with multiple names and identities make it easier for Roy to become Rock? To shed oneself and adopt another? Did the poverty and instability teach him that survival meant pleasing others? Performing whatever role kept you safe and fed? Did serving in the military, surrounded by aggressive masculinity, show him exactly what mask he needed to wear to hide his true self? Wilson brought Roy to Hollywood in 1948 and immediately set about reconstruction. First, the name, Roy Fitzgerald, wasn't marquee-worthy. Wilson chose Rock for strength, masculinity, immovability. Hudson for the river, for flow and power. Rock Hudson, a name that sounded like a movie star, like someone who could carry a film, like American masculinity itself. But creating Rock Hudson required more than a name change. Roy's teeth were crooked. They fixed them. His voice had a Midwestern flatness. They hired coaches to smooth it out, to give it depth and warmth. His acting was non-existent. They sent him to lessons, taught him to hit marks and remember lines. His walk wasn't confident enough. They made him practice moving like someone who owned every room he entered. And there was the other thing, the biggest thing, the thing that could never be mentioned directly. Henry Wilson knew Roy was gay. Wilson himself was gay, though Hollywood pretended otherwise. He knew that Rock Hudson's career, like the careers of so many other closeted actors Wilson represented, depended on absolute secrecy. Being the handsome leading man and being gay were incompatible in the 1940s Hollywood. One truth had to be buried so the other could flourish. Roy became Rock. The transformation was complete. The telephone repairman from Illinois was gone, erased, replaced by this magnificent creation. 6'4" of sculpted masculinity, the fantasy made flesh. Rock Hudson was born. Roy Fitzgerald began to die. It would take 37 years for that death to be complete. But the process started here, in these Hollywood studios where they polished and perfected until nothing real remained. His first roles were bit parts, walk-ons, the kind of work that taught you the mechanics of film acting without risking much. Fighter Squadron, 1948. Undertow, 1949. Rock was learning slowly how to be present on screen without being wooden. The camera did love him. That much was clear. Even in terrible films, even with terrible dialogue, there was something about him, a magnetism, a presence, a sense that this man mattered. Universal Studios signed him in 1949, seeing in Rock Hudson what Wilson had seen, a product they could mold, market, and profit from. They put him in more films, bigger roles, watching audience reactions. Women loved him. He was safe, unthreatening, the kind of handsome that made you dream but never demanded anything back. Men liked him too. He wasn't too pretty, wasn't effeminate, seemed like the kind of guy you could have a beer with. But here's what nobody knew. Every night after the shoots and the publicity dinners and the carefully staged dates, Rock went home alone, or not alone, but secretly to the men he actually wanted, in places where he wouldn't be seen, wouldn't be photographed, wouldn't destroy everything he was building. He was learning to live two lives, and the gap between them was already beginning to feel unbearable. By 1950, Rock Hudson was a working actor with a growing following. Studio executives whispered about making him a star. But first, they had to make him perfect. And perfection, in Hollywood's estimation, meant erasing everything real about Roy Fitzgerald until only the image remained, strong, straight, safe. The man every woman wanted and no woman could have. The question nobody asked was whether Rock wanted this, whether being famous was worth being fake, whether stardom justified the erasure of self. But in 1950s Hollywood, those questions didn't matter. The machine needed leading men, and Rock Hudson was exactly what they needed, as long as he never ever told the truth. The breakthrough came in 1954 with Magnificent Obsession, directed by Douglas Sirk and starring Rock opposite Jane Wyman. Suddenly, Rock Hudson wasn't just another handsome face. He was a star, a leading man who could carry a picture, a box office draw. The film was a massive hit, and Rock's performance, while not exactly subtle, had something. A vulnerability beneath the masculine exterior, a sense that this perfect man might be hiding pain. Critics noticed, audiences swooned, Universal knew they had something valuable, and they protected their investment fiercely. When rumors began circulating about Rock's sexuality, and they always did in a town built on gossip, the studio moved quickly. The solution was simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Marriage. Phyllis Gates was Henry Wilson's secretary, a woman who'd been around the Hollywood closet long enough to understand how it worked. In 1955, Rock married her in a ceremony that made headlines, put him on magazine covers, and supposedly put the rumors to rest. He was 30, she was 28, and on paper they were perfect together. But perfection was the point. This wasn't a marriage, it was a press release. Behind closed doors, Rock was still Rock, still gay, still living in fear. The marriage lasted 3 years before ending in quiet divorce, having served its purpose. Protecting Rock Hudson's image long enough for him to become irreplaceable. Yet there were moments, rare, precious moments, when Rock could breathe. At his house in Beverly Hills behind closed doors, he hosted parties for gay friends and industry insiders. Men who understood, who lived the same double life. Here, for a few hours, Rock could be Roy again. Could hold hands with someone he cared about. Could laugh without calculating whether the laugh sounded too feminine. Could just exist without the constant performance. One regular guest at these parties was Lee Garlington, a stockbroker Rock dated seriously in the late 1950s. Lee later recalled, "Rock would literally wait until we were safely behind the gates of his house before he'd relax, before his shoulders would drop, before he'd smile for real. The moment we left, the mask went back on. I watched him do it, watched Roy disappear and Rock return like a light switching off. That was the pattern. Performance in public, brief authenticity in private, always aware that one photograph, one loose word, one betrayed confidence could end everything. Rock learned to trust no one completely, to keep even his lovers at arm's length, to never fully relax. The paranoia wasn't unreasonable. It was survival. Giant came in 1956, putting Rock on screen with Elizabeth Taylor and James Dean. Watch that film now and you see something poignant. 3 icons, 3 tragedies waiting to happen. Dean would be dead before the film premiered, killed in a car crash at 24. Taylor would survive 8 marriages and countless personal dramas, becoming both legend and cautionary tale. And Rock would spend the next 30 years living a lie, the secret eating away at him like cancer. His chemistry with Taylor was real. They became lifelong friends. 2 people who understood that Hollywood demanded performance both on and off screen. She knew about his sexuality and didn't care, or rather cared about him too much to let it matter. Years later, when he was dying, she would be there. But in 1956, they were just 2 beautiful people making a movie, both playing roles that would define and confine them. The late 1950s and early 1960s were Rock Hudson's golden age. Pillow Talk, 1959. With Doris Day created a new genre, the romantic comedy where the leading man was charming, non-threatening, the perfect fantasy partner. Rock and Doris made 3 films together, and their on-screen chemistry was so natural that people assumed they were lovers off-screen too. The irony was exquisite. Rock Hudson playing straight so convincingly that audiences couldn't imagine him any other way, while the truth remained locked away. Imagine if they knew the truth, Rock supposedly joked to friends during Pillow Talk filming. They'd never laugh again. He was right. The entire appeal of these movies rested on Rock being safely heterosexual, charmingly masculine, attainable if only you were the right woman. If audiences knew that Rock wasn't interested in Doris, that he was going home to men whose names never appeared in the press, the fantasy would collapse. But maintaining that fantasy required constant vigilance. Rock dated actresses for publicity. He gave interviews about looking for the right woman to settle down with. He attended premieres with starlets on his arm, smiled for cameras, played the role of Hollywood's most eligible bachelor even as he approached 40, then 50. Every public moment was performance, every interview a carefully scripted lie. Behind the scenes, Rock was living a different life. He owned a house in Beverly Hills where he could be himself, where he hosted parties for gay friends and industry insiders who knew the truth. He had relationships, real ones, with men he cared about, but always in secret, always with the understanding that if anyone talked, if any hint of truth reached the press, his career was over. The toll this took was invisible at first. Rock drank, not heavily enough to be a problem, just enough to dull the constant anxiety. He became guarded, careful, learning to watch every word, every gesture, every interaction for signs that might betray him. "I am the loneliest leading man in Hollywood," he told a close friend. It sounds dramatic, but it was literal truth. Surrounded by millions of adoring fans, Rock Hudson was completely alone, unable to show anyone who he really was. Did he resent it? Probably. Did he consider coming out? Never, not in an era when being gay meant career death, legal persecution, social ostracism. Rock had grown up poor, had worked too hard to build this success, understood too well that the world didn't make exceptions for honesty. So he kept playing the part, kept being Rock Hudson, kept letting Roy Fitzgerald fade further into memory. The 1960s brought more success. Lover Come Back, Send Me No Flowers, other romantic comedies that recycled the formula audiences loved. Rock was reliable, bankable, the kind of star studios could build around. But he was also approaching 50, and Hollywood's appetite for aging romantic leads was limited, especially for men who'd never married, again, who still gave interviews about finding the right woman someday. Television saved him, or trapped him further, depending on how you looked at it. Macmillan and Wife, 1971 to 1977, cast Rock as a police commissioner married to a younger woman, a role that let him be paternal, authoritative, safely domesticated. The show was successful, kept him famous, gave him financial security. It also meant 6 more years of playing straight, of pretending, of being the husband while never being a husband, of modeling the very life he could never have. Behind all this success, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? When Rock stood on set delivering lines about love and marriage, when he kissed his co-stars and made it look real, when he went home to empty houses or secret relationships that could never be acknowledged, did he think about the life Roy Fitzgerald might have lived? Did he dream about a world where he could hold hands with someone he loved in public, where his relationships weren't shameful secrets, where being Rock Hudson didn't require erasing everything real? By the late 1970s, Rock was in his 50s, wealthy, famous, and completely trapped. He couldn't retire. What would he retire to? He couldn't come out, too much to lose, too many years invested in the lie. He couldn't even slow down without people asking questions. So he kept working, kept performing, kept being the man every woman wanted while desperately wishing he could be the man he was. The 1980s brought 2 things, the AIDS epidemic and Rock Hudson's final secret. In 1984, he began noticing symptoms: fatigue, lesions, weight loss. He was diagnosed with AIDS in June 1984, but told almost no one. For over a year, he kept working, kept traveling, kept up appearances even as the disease progressed. Because that's what Rock Hudson did. He maintained the image no matter what it cost. The end was coming, and Rock knew it. But even dying, he tried to keep the secret, tried to protect the lie he'd lived for 35 years. Because if AIDS revealed his sexuality, if the disease exposed what he'd spent a lifetime hiding, then everything, the career, the fame, the carefully constructed perfect man, would be exposed as fraud. And Rock Hudson had already lost too much to lose the image, too. In July 1985, Rock Hudson collapsed in Paris. The photos hit the press, Rock, gaunt and skeletal, barely recognizable. The speculation began immediately. What disease could do this to the most handsome man in America? Rock's publicists tried to maintain silence, but silence was no longer possible. On July 25, 1985, the announcement came. Rock Hudson had AIDS. The world stopped. AIDS had been killing people for 4 years. Gay men, drug users, the disposable populations America was content to ignore. But Rock Hudson wasn't disposable. Rock Hudson was America's leading man, the safe fantasy, the man in everyone's living room. If AIDS could touch Rock Hudson, it could touch anyone. Suddenly, the gay plague became everyone's concern. But the diagnosis meant more than just AIDS. It meant the other secret could no longer be hidden. Because how did Rock Hudson, the ultimate ladies' man, contract a disease spread primarily through gay sex? The press danced around it, but everyone understood. Rock Hudson was gay, had always been gay, had spent 35 years of fame living a lie. The perfect man had never existed at all. Rock checked into UCLA Medical Center, and the world watched him die. Not privately, not quietly, but as a public spectacle, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything America feared about AIDS. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His face was covered in lesions. The matinee idol had become a skeleton, and still the cameras wanted pictures. Elizabeth Taylor visited, held his hand, wept for the friend she'd known was living on borrowed time since the moment he became famous. Doris Day sent messages. She couldn't bring herself to see him like this, to watch the man she'd made those cheerful romantic comedies with waste away. Other friends stayed away too, whether from fear of contagion or inability to face mortality, who knows. Mark Christian, Rock's last partner, was there. Complicated, angry, scared. Rock had known he had AIDS for months before telling Mark, a fact that would lead to lawsuits, recriminations, ugly revelations. But in that hospital room, surrounded by what remained of Rock Hudson, such disputes seemed small compared to the larger tragedy. A man who'd spent his entire adult life unable to be himself, who'd maintained a lie until disease made truth unavoidable. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their public image? Can an actor who spends decades playing straight ever be forgiven for that deception, even when the deception was survival? Rock Hudson spent his final days wrestling with these questions, watching news coverage that discussed his sexuality like a scandal rather than a tragedy, seeing his life reduced to headlines. Rock Hudson gay, Rock Hudson dying, the secret life of Rock Hudson. AIDS is not just my disease, he said in one of his final public statements, read by others because he could no longer speak. It is our wake-up call. It was generous, making his death meaningful, trying to save others with the admission that had come too late to save himself. But it was also heartbreaking. Rock Hudson's final role was Martyr, symbol, the famous face that forced America to care about an epidemic it had been content to ignore. He died on October 2, 1985 at 59. Too young. Far too young. The man who'd survived poverty, survived the Hollywood closet, survived decades of living a lie, couldn't survive AIDS. The disease that was killing thousands in silence killed Rock Hudson in the spotlight. And in that spotlight, finally, America paid attention. The funeral was small, private. As private as anything about Rock Hudson's death could be. Elizabeth Taylor gave a eulogy, spoke of the real Rock, the Roy she'd known behind the image. Then she did something more. She took up the fight against AIDS, channeling her grief into activism, founding the American Foundation for AIDS Research, using her considerable fame to demand funding, research, compassion for the dying. Was Rock Hudson's death tragedy or opportunity? Both inseparably woven. He died of AIDS, yes, but he died more fundamentally of a lifetime of secrets, of being someone else every public moment, of loving in shadows and shame. His death forced America to acknowledge AIDS, to fund research, to treat it as a crisis affecting everyone, not just the marginalized. In death, Rock Hudson did more for the gay community than he ever could in life, when admission would have ended his career. But what did it cost him? Dying in the spotlight, his sexuality exposed as scandal rather than celebrated as truth, his life reduced to lies and disease. He played heroes on screen but lived in fear off screen, and in the end, the fear won. Or perhaps the lie won. Or perhaps nothing won, and Rock Hudson was simply another casualty of a system that demands stars check their humanity at the door. Were these final months acts of courage or simply inevitability? When Rock finally acknowledged his AIDS, when the truth about his sexuality became undeniable, was it brave confession or forced admission? He'd kept the secret for a year after diagnosis, kept working, kept pretending. Only when pretending became impossible did he tell the truth, and even then he framed it as awakening, as sacrifice, as gift to others rather than admission of his own life lived falsely. His grave marker is simple: Rock Hudson. Not Roy Scherer, not Roy Fitzgerald, the names his parents gave him. The invented name, the Hollywood creation, the lie that became more real than reality. Because that's what Rock Hudson was, a perfect performance of masculinity, sustained for so long that the performer was lost entirely, leaving only the role. What do we take from Rock Hudson's story? That stardom requires sacrifice, certainly. That the closet kills, slowly and surely. That America creates heroes and then punishes them for being human. That loving someone in secret for decades might be survival, but it's a form of dying too. Rock Hudson wanted to be a star. He succeeded beyond measure, but success meant becoming someone else entirely, erasing Roy Fitzgerald until only Rock remained. Strong, straight, safe. The man every woman wanted but who couldn't want them back. The perfect gentleman who was never allowed to be imperfect, to be real, to be himself. Hollywood made me the man every woman wanted, he said. It never let me be the man I was. That sentence contains a lifetime of loss. The relationships he couldn't acknowledge, the love he couldn't show, the decades of performance that became his only reality. Rock Hudson proved you could be the biggest star in Hollywood and still be completely alone, trapped inside an image so perfect it became a prison. His legacy is complex. He was a talented actor who brought joy to millions through romantic comedies that seem quaint now. He was a tragic figure, destroyed by a system that demanded he hide his true self. He was, inadvertently, a revolutionary, the first major celebrity whose AIDS diagnosis forced America to confront an epidemic, to see victims as human rather than statistics. Elizabeth Taylor continued his work, made AIDS awareness her mission, told anyone who would listen about the friend who died in shame when he should have lived in pride. The research funding that came after Rock's death saved countless lives. Too late for him, but not too late for others. His death, tragic and public, became the catalyst for change he could never have achieved in life. But the question remains, was it worth it? Trading authenticity for fame, self for success, truth for image? Rock Hudson became immortal, his face forever young in those romantic comedies, forever the perfect leading man. But the price was his soul, his chance at real love, his ability to live openly as himself. And when AIDS forced the truth into daylight, it came not as liberation but as exposure, scandal, the final betrayal of a man who'd been betrayed from the beginning. If Hollywood could turn a telephone repairman into the ideal man, what else could it create? What other illusions seem so real we forget they're performed? How many other Rock Hudsons exist, playing parts written by others, trapped inside images that don't fit, dying slowly behind perfect smiles? The perfect man never existed. Rock Hudson was created, manufactured, polished until Roy Fitzgerald disappeared completely. And when Rock died, taking his secrets and his pain with him, what remained was the image, the handsome leading man, the charming romantic, the safe fantasy. That image is eternal. But somewhere underneath it all, buried beneath decades of performance and lies, was Roy. Just Roy, a kid from Illinois who wanted to be loved for who he was, not who he pretended to be. He never got that wish. Hollywood wouldn't allow it. America wouldn't allow it. The Times wouldn't allow it. So Roy became Rock, and Rock became legend, and the legend became tragedy. And we're left with questions that have no comfortable answers. How many people must perform perfection at the cost of their souls? How many must die in closets while the world applauds their images? How many perfect men must we create before we realize that perfection itself is the cruelest lie of all? Rock Hudson played heroes on screen. Off screen, he lived in fear. And in the end, fear and disease took everything. The career, the image, the life he might have lived if only being himself had been allowed. His story is Hollywood's story. Create the dream, destroy the dreamer, and never, ever acknowledge the cost. The man every woman wanted never wanted women. The perfect gentleman was perfectly fake, and Rock Hudson, having given Hollywood everything it asked for, died alone with the truth that could never be spoken until speaking it no longer mattered. That's not triumph. That's tragedy. Pure, devastating, utterly American tragedy.